Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. Each week of this podcast is either an interview with a guest or multiple guests or a solo episode where I unpack some scholarship in relation to computer science education. In this week's episode, I'm unpacking a paper titled Performing Algorithms, Weaving as Promising Context for Computational Learning. And this paper is written by Anna Keune. Here's the abstract for this paper. Quote, an important aspect of diversifying STEM fields, including computing, is to better understand how tools and materials that are associated with socio-historical practices of underrepresented populations are aligned with disciplinary concepts and what these materials contribute to teaching and learning. Taking a constructionist stance, this study builds on the presence of electronic textiles in the learning sciences to investigate the alignment of electronically augmented fiber crafts with core computer science concepts through an idea of epistemological pluralism. Through an artifact analysis with computer science instructors, the study found that weaving and manipulating fabric are aligned with core computational concepts, and that one craft activity requires multiple approaches to computational concepts. The work points to a particular instance of epistemological pluralism and the potential of fiber crafts as a context for understanding transfer of computational concepts across multiple representations, end quote. If I were to summarize this paper into a single sentence, I'd say that this paper explores analyzing weaving as a potential practice for exploring computer science concepts. As always, you can find a link to this paper in the show notes, which is available at jaredoleary.com, where you'll find hundreds, if not thousands, of free computer science education resources, as well as well over 1,000 hours of drumming content and a bunch of gaming content as well. So I curate content for leisure and for work, which, speaking of, this podcast is powered by Boot Up Professional Development, which is the nonprofit that I work for. You can learn more about the free computer science resources that I've created at bootuppd.org and even learn more about our paid professional development. All right, so the introduction for this very short paper describes how women are traditionally underrepresented in computing and that there are some different approaches that have been used to try and foster a sense of belonging within the field. And one of those approaches was actually engaging in electronic textiles. So think of like the ugly sweaters that you see around holiday times in the winter that might light up, or maybe shoes that when you step, it will do some kind of a design or pattern using LEDs, or even something as simple as a teddy bear. When you squeeze it, it plays a recorded sound, or even something more complicated like Imogen Heap's gloves that would allow you to manipulate or create music with your hand. These are all different examples of electronic textiles. Now, there have been a variety of educational research studies on electronic textiles, quote, which augment the feminized practices of sewing with electronic components, demonstrated new leadership opportunities for girls, improve learning outcomes for all students, and inroads for rupturing dominant computing cultures, end quote. Yet it remains underexplored how fiber crafts in their own right, without electronic components, align with core computational concepts, and whether they present relevant context for further inquiry of computational learning while fostering a sense of belonging, end quote. That's from PDF page 1. I really like that idea. I have often seen e-textiles, but not necessarily fiber crafts, explored in computer science, computational thinking, computational literacies, etc. I have seen some people discuss cybersecurity in relation to different braiding patterns that historically were used from different cultures to communicate hidden messages. So depending on the color patterns or designs, etc., of like a braided cord or something, that would basically be used as a letter containing a cipher that needed to be read by somebody else without being intercepted and understood by somebody in between, like whoever was delivering the message or something. So I've heard of that as being a really interesting way of exploring some concepts in cybersecurity. And so when I saw this title, I was like, oh, this is really interesting. I too am curious about whether or not you can explore textiles in relation to computer science, computational thinking, computational literacies, etc., without actually engaging in the electronic components of things. So the question that guides this is from page 1, is, quote, how do fiber crafts, i.e. weaving and manipulating fabric, align with computational concepts, end quote. So the first section after the introduction is titled Potential of Fiber Crafts for Inclusive Computer Science Learning. Now, the author mentions that for centuries, fiber crafts has been a part of the life experiences of women around the world, and that electronic textiles in particular has been a way that youth, especially young girls, have been able to engage in STEM or STEAM ideas. But what has not been looked at least according to the author, and at least according to what I've seen, or rather have not seen, is people have not yet explored whether or not the production of textiles is actually something that can serve as a starting point for fostering a sense of belonging in computing or computer science. So the next section of the paper talks about a material dimension of epistemological pluralism. So here are a couple of quotes from page 2. Quote, "The constructionist idea of epistemological pluralism theorizes multiple ways of getting to know an idea as a key to domain learning." End quote. A little bit further down. Quote, "For example, when looking at weaving as a form of algorithmic doing, the process of programming in which writers determine the outcome becomes closer to live coding that produces an unfolding algorithm of person and loom combinations. In this case, the socio-material practices of loom and people frame the typical programming approach to algorithmic doing as something very different yet valuable. The ontological threads within constructionist ideas of epistemological pluralism and technology studies prompted the present study to consider what fiber crafts materials bring to computational learning." End quote. So I have to confess, I haven't really read much about epistemological pluralism, but it sounds a lot like what I've talked about with multi-perspectivalism and even Rogalski's paper on methodology and the importance of having an understanding and habit of using a variety of pedagogical practices rather than just adhering to one method at the cost of ignoring all others. But then from a student standpoint, the idea of being able to look at something almost like it were, a gem with many different facets and understanding that if you rotate, you can look at the same concept from a different angle or a different lens or different perspective to understand it in a new way or in relation to other ideas or concepts from other domains. So this part really resonated for me. Now, the next part is actually on the methods. So what they did is they took a bunch of projects that were produced by middle school kids in a fiber crafts course. Instructors of computer science then spent about 60 minutes analyzing the artifacts that were created by students, and these artifacts were about 20 photographs per student per session that they're creating something. And so they looked at it from different angles, zooming in to be able to show the different types of stitches, weaving techniques, etc. After the computer science instructors analyzed the artifacts, they then did an analysis of the artifact analysis sessions. So this used thematic coding that was related to the K-12 computer science framework, specifically the core concepts of algorithms, variables, control structures, modularity, and troubleshooting. So in other words, instructors of computer science looked at some weaving projects created by middle school students, specifically some pictures of them. And then the researcher took those analyses and used the K-12 computer science framework as a lens to be able to look at this and try and make sense of how does this relate. Now, even though the author found connections across all 5 of those computational concepts, this particular paper just focuses on algorithms, which they define as, quote, "routines that can be performed by people and computers to accomplish tasks. Algorithms require effective communication with a computer by sorting algorithmic tasks and subtasks for computers to read and respond to," end quote. And the author noted that there were 3 types of approaches to algorithms. One was syntax-oriented, one was spatial, and then one was performative approaches to algorithms. Here's a quote from PDF page 3 that is really interesting, and it honestly includes a lot of jargon that I don't understand because I haven't done fiber crafts. Quote, "For weaving, 92% of instructors, N of 11, highlighted the repetitive process of changing heddle positions paired with shuttle directions in a plain weave as algorithmic. A heddle is a flat piece with long and short openings for lift threads. A shuttle is a carrier of yarn. For example, to create a plain weave pattern, weavers had to lift the heddle to part lengthwise threads and draw the shuttle with yarn between the threads in one direction. Then to weave another row, weavers had to lower the heddle and draw the shuttle with yarn between the threads in opposite direction. This pairing of heddle positions and shuttle directions remained for the duration of the weave. Instructors connected the algorithmic aspects of weaving to a syntax-oriented approach of instructing a computer like a programming language," end quote. I don't know about you, but whenever I hear a domain that uses very specific language that I have no familiarity with, I feel like I'm studying Japanese because there are words where I'm just I have no idea what that means, but it's interesting. Now, another really interesting thing is that the author mentions that kids actually planned out what they were going to weave using coordinate paper. So they'd draw on it, and there's a picture on PDF page 3, so you can see how they kind of drew out the patterns they're going to use. And to me, this really reminded me of pseudocode and just program development and planning, which naive me didn't realize was very similar to what you, I guess, would do when weaving, or might do. Now, the last area of algorithms that was really interesting that the author mentioned is that there is a performative approach to algorithms. And as somebody who has explored live coding in the sense of live coding music, like algoraving, creating live music by typing out lines of code, this really intrigued me. The performative aspects of coding can be really fascinating. And so to see this in a physical creation rather than a digital one really kind of caught my attention. So here's a quote from PDF page 3. Quote, "The algorithmic performance, i.e. the repetitive process of changing heddle positions paired with shuttle directions done by the loom and the youth, translated coordinate patterns into fabric. Instructors recognize the use process of weaving yarn into a matrix of warp threads as the way a computer would process a program. Youth perform the algorithm like how a computer would process a program rather than communicate it in a machine-readable form for a computer to perform." End quote. So that's really interesting. Rather than having a computer compute something, a person is performing the algorithm that you may have written out on like graph paper, coordinate paper. Kind of reminds me of the like program a robot where like kids will do an unplugged where you like write out a line of code and then somebody else will pretend to be a robot who's going to follow that line of code, or like the peanut butter and jelly thing that a lot of people will do, where it's like, okay, you're going to write out the algorithm for creating a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and then like the teacher will do that algorithm and it'll like, you got all messed up because the kids don't mention like, oh, you're supposed to use a knife to spread it. So the teacher will use like, I don't know, their fingers or a pencil or something. All of these are examples of like how you can perform a series of steps that might just be described as an algorithm, but in this case, you're actually weaving it. So in the last section is the discussion and implications. The author basically says that, hey, there are at least 3 approaches to algorithms that can be found in weaving. And this is something that we should continue to investigate in relation to computational learning. So for example, the author mentions perhaps we could explore how students might complete pseudocode translations of a project, or maybe correct some mistakes, like debug some issues that might arrive in the pseudocode or in the weaving itself. This would result in some interesting forms of potential transfer that the author mentions we could explore. But here's the final closing paragraph from page 4. Quote, "The relationships among approaches to algorithms were nonlinear. Rather than one leading approach, the translations across approaches to algorithms inform each other. For example, while a graphed plan could be implemented one-to-one by performing the illustrated algorithm, changes to the pattern can happen on the go, resulting in edits to the graph plan. The fact that weaving fabric can involve multiple nonlinear approaches to algorithms within the same craft presents a particular instantiation of epistemological pluralism. Where weaving provides several ways of engaging with a domain idea that weavers can select from, weaving also makes it possible to engage with more than one approach to algorithms. This leads to considering epistemological pluralism in terms of recognizing multiple ways to approach a domain conceptual understanding simultaneously by one person, along with socio-historical promise of fibercrafts as fostering computational belonging for women in computing. The expanded understanding of epistemological pluralism further warrants additional studies that explore the utility of fibercrafts as context for computational learning." End quote. And I totally agree. This is a really interesting thing to look at, and it's definitely worth exploring some more. Now, at the end of each one of these Unpacking Scholarship episodes, I like to share some lingering questions or thoughts. This is not meant to critique of the authors or anything like that, just me kind of sharing what I thought, to hopefully encourage some dialogue within the field, or even on this podcast if you'd like to come on and chat with me about it, which you can do by pressing the Contact Me button on my website, jaredoleary.com. So one thing that I wondered is what students would have said about their artifacts if they were interviewed. So just because we can find evidence of a concept or a practice or standard in an artifact does not necessarily mean the student also sees or understands that connection or relationship. Like I had some students who would accidentally stumble upon a concept like, I don't know, recursion or something. And when I'd ask them like, oh, how did you know how to do that? Sometimes they'd go, I don't know, I accidentally dragged the block in there and then it worked the right way. And then other times I'd ask them that and they go, oh, well, in a different programming language that I was using for a different project, I could do it. So then I wondered, how could I do it in this new language and new project? So sometimes it is the actual transfer, and other times it's just a happy accident. So we can't necessarily assume that a student understands what we actually understand in C. So for example, there could be some bias on the behalf of not only who is analyzing the artifacts, but also what tool they're using to analyze the artifacts. That might bias the findings in a way that would ignore the null examples. So for example, if you give a music composition to a mathematician, they might look at the mathematical relationships between, I don't know, the frequency combinations within a chord progression or something like that. But a computer scientist might categorize a leitmotif as an example of a function. But a poet might analyze the structure of the lyrics, and then a synesthete might map out the melody and harmony and color palettes, etc. All of these are interesting lenses or ways of exploring a composition that relate to different expertises or domains, but the composer who created the composition might not have actually thought about any of that while creating the piece, nor actually understand these different perspectives. And I say that as somebody who has written music, and to hear people analyze the music that I've written, I've gone, oh, that's an interesting perspective that I was not at all thinking of when I wrote that. But yeah, I can see how that relates to whatever thing they mentioned. So the same thing might be happening when we are analyzing an artifact. Yes, you might be able to find computational or computing concepts within some kind of artifact, but it doesn't necessarily mean the person who created it was thinking of it in that way. Nor does it necessarily mean that it would be helpful for a creator to think of it in that way. Like, I often hear people say that, oh, well, in this very specific song by like David Bowie, it's got some loops in it. So therefore, composers and musicians should think of music in terms of computational literacies or computational thinking. Well, no, but I've already ranted about that in other podcasts, so I won't do that here. Another question that I have is, when might integration be an activity that serves as a metaphor or a medium for learning a computer science concept or practice? And when might that be problematic? So for example, is this a subservient relationship? If we'd ever start explore this in a computer science class, would we then be engaging in the arts only for the purpose of learning a computer science concept or practice rather than actually to create art or textiles, which I would argue is a form of art? And if we do find these metaphors or mediums for exploring a concept, are there opportunities for further exploration with increasing complexity? Or is it just like a one-off activity where we go, cool, I reinforced an understanding of a concept, now I don't ever need to do that again, because further exploration would not yield any different understandings? And that's something I genuinely don't know, because I've never done weaving. But to get on my soapbox again, I have seen some people provide some interesting metaphors in relation to music that are great for a single activity, but would not stand the test of time if you were to try and continue to dive into those relationships between music and computational thinking, as it's often defined. It can skim the surface of understandings, but that's about it, in my opinion. And for those of you that don't know, my background's in music education. All three of my degrees are in music education, taught general music band. That's why I'm focusing on the music side of things. All right, so the last question that I have is, where is the line for you when you consider something to be an example of CS or CT, and when it isn't? I'm a bit more skeptical of when something is an example of CS or CT. I tend to be more skeptical than most people when it comes to this, but it's probably because of my background in the arts, where I've seen people kind of misuse or abuse the arts in a transactional way, as Nate Stottlemyre might describe it. So that's a bias that I have that you might disagree with, and we can chat about it. But those are some lingering thoughts. I've really thought this was an interesting paper, which is why I want to share it as a podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, consider sharing with somebody else or leaving a review on whatever platform you're listening to this on. Again, you can find a link to the article by clicking the link in the app that you're listening to this on, or by going to the show notes at jaredoleary.com. Thank you so much for listening. Stay tuned for another episode next week, and until then, I hope you're all staying safe and are having a wonderful week.